So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another episode of Day to Day Around the House. In this video, I'm going to be replacing a drain assembly in a tub. The reason I had to do this is the stopper part of the drain was stripped out and would no longer work correctly, basically leaving an open drain in that tub. And I was really worried about something falling in there and possibly clogging up the plumbing and causing a lot bigger problem. I actually put this project off for quite some time because I was too worried about possibly having something happen in the process of replacing it and causing a bigger issue, but everything went pretty smoothly and it was actually a pretty cheap and easy repair to do. So I'm going to go over step by step how I did this project, and I am going to include the mistakes I made, so hopefully you guys don't make those same mistakes. And let's get to it. So there's only a couple things you're going to need in order to do this repair. One is obviously the drain itself. Then you also need a drain removal tool. I got mine off of Amazon for right around $9. And then you will need a container of plumber's putty and a decent sized crescent wrench. I also ended up using a pair of needle nose and a couple small screwdrivers to dig out the crap that was in the drain, along with a shop vac. So you will need to remove your water stopper if it's still in the drain and working and you're replacing this for some other reason by unscrewing it counterclockwise in order to remove it. Then I grabbed that $9 tool I bought off of Amazon. I highly recommend getting it. There is some other ways of possibly removing this drain, but I don't recommend doing that because if something goes wrong, you end up breaking one of those tabs off, and you could end up creating a lot more issues instead of fixing the problem that you had to begin with. So once the stopper is removed out of the drain, you just set the tool down in place, then grab yourself a crescent wrench or a wrench that fits that tool. Use one hand to put a little bit of down pressure on that tool so it doesn't strip out, and crank that wrench counterclockwise to loosen the drain and remove it. You will want to use a decent sized crescent wrench in order to break this free because it did take a good amount of force to break it loose. I had to use a wrench to loosen it up about 2 or 3 turns, and then I was able to do the rest by hand. Once removing the drain, then I went ahead and dug around in there to get as much nasty crap out as I possibly could.
Fucking gross, man.
I also ended up finding a screw that was down inside the drain. I have no idea where that came from. I used a pair of needle nose to remove the screw and get some of the other hair out of the drain. I actually got this wire brush set from Ross Dress for Less, and yes, you heard me right on that. So I figured I'd use that to clean up any of the old plumber's putty that was still stuck in the threads of the pipe and around the hole in the bath pan. Now there is a rubber gasket between the bottom of the bathtub and the top of the ABS fitting that the drain threads into. You do want to be careful not to dislodge that while you're cleaning out the residual plumber's putty from around those areas. I used my shop vac to suck up any debris that had fallen down in the drain itself and around where the new drain was going to seal, so I had a nice clean surface to work with. Because I did struggle with getting the old drain completely out of the threads and it kind of fought me all the way, I decided just to use some vegetable oil or any kind of a food grade oil to lubricate the threads in the ABS fitting a little bit to make it easier to thread in. Now this probably isn't recommended by most plumbers, but with the way the old drain fought me unthreading it the entire way, I felt this was a good idea to do. So your new drain is going to come with a rubber seal. That is for between the bottom of the tub and the top of the fitting where the drain threads into, so you're going to go ahead and just discard that. Then I got some plumber's putty, and I've had this plumber's putty for quite some time, and the lid was cracked, so it was dried out pretty good. If that happens to you, just mix a little bit more water into it, squeeze it between your fingers, and it should loosen back up to the point where it's pliable and good to use again. Once you get your plumber's putty pliable, or if you got new stuff, you don't have to go through that step. You're going to grab a little bit of a chunk of it and just roll it between your hands into the shape of a nice long worm that does not have any cracks in the plumber's putty. If you have cracks, just continue to roll it until all those cracks are gone. Then go ahead and apply that plumber's putty underneath the lip of the drain, connecting the two ends and kind of squishing them together again to get all the cracks out of the plumber's putty. So this is the most common way to apply the plumber's putty to the new drain. However, I did mine a little differently. I applied my plumber's putty to the top of the bathtub and then a little bit inside the threads of the fitting that the drain screws into. The reason I did this is that made sure that I did have some plumber's putty going in those threads as I tightened the drain down to ensure a good seal. Now I did have a couple issues because I put the plumber's putty on this way. One of the main problems I had was it did take me a couple times to get this drain to thread in properly without cross threading, and every time I'd have to pull it up to see what was going on, that plumber's putty would come off and I'd have to redo and reapply the plumber's putty. Now, the fact that I had a hard time getting it to go in correctly without cross threading had nothing to do with the way I applied the plumber's putty. It's just the fact that I had to redo it every time I had to lift it up and see what was going on. If the plumber's putty was on the bottom of the drain instead of on top of the tub and in the fitting, that wouldn't have been a problem. If I had it to do over again, I probably would have put the plumber's putty on the bottom of the drain and then maybe just took a very thin, small amount and coated the outside of the threads themselves on the drain and threaded it in that way. That way, as you thread the new drain into the fitting, it would have pushed any extra putty up towards the top of the drain instead of pushing it down into the drain itself. Even though it's not really needed because that is the purpose of the rubber washer that's between the bath pan and the fitting itself. Now, I have heard of people pushing down on that pipe a little bit with the blunt end of a screwdriver in order to remove and replace that gasket to create a little gap between the fitting and the tub. I just didn't feel the need to do that, but that is why I wanted to make sure there was a little bit of extra sealing on the threads of that fitting just to be safe. So the major concern when putting this drain in is making sure you don't cross thread it into that fitting. If you end up cross threading that fitting underneath the tub and messing it up where that drain will not pull tight, then you're going to end up having to pull that tub out and replace that piece of ABS underneath there. And that's a whole can of worms and a lot of money that you don't want to have to do. Another mistake I made was actually I tried using the wrench to get it started once. This was a bad idea. I started cross threading it, and because I had the leverage of the wrench, I didn't realize it at first. So you do want to make sure you start this by hand. Especially with the fact that I oiled those threads, making it easier to thread in. I should have known better, but I was getting frustrated because I was struggling with it. Now, I did realize it soon enough where I didn't do any serious damage to those threads. And right here, as I pulled this out the last time, you can see that that plumber's putty was working its way down the threads, which is what I was trying to accomplish with the way I applied it. So I did finally get this thing to thread in correctly. The only thing I really did differently is when I put it in place, I kind of rocked it side to side and front to back just to help center it, and then went ahead and started it by hand. Once getting it all the way tight by hand, I couldn't go anymore. I did take the wrench and put a couple more turns on it to snug it down. It should squeeze a layer of that plumber's putty all the way around the drain. If you're missing it in a spot, you might want to take it back up and re-plumber's putty it to make sure you do have a good seal. I removed all the plumber's putty that had squeezed out between the drain and the tub, which led me to the other small issue that I had because I put the plumber's putty down inside the tub and the fitting instead of on the bottom of the drain. Some of that plumber's putty did squish out from the threads and go down into the drain itself. So the good part about that is I do know that some of the plumber's putty did make it down in the threads of the fitting, helping seal underneath the tub. The bad part about it is the plumber's putty then possibly fell down in the drain and could create a clog. Even though these pieces are very small and that wasn't likely, I did feel I need to get them out. So I just used a couple small screwdrivers and either poked them and lifted them out or pinched them between the two and pulled them out that way. Once getting all those little chunks of plumber's putty out of the drain itself, then all that's left to do was thread the stopper part of the drain into place by threading it in clockwise, and that's all there is to it, guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.